You really think you belong here? Richard Hale's laugh echoed through the marble courtroom, bouncing off the high ceilings, drawing smirks and whispers from the spectators crowded into the wooden benches. Amara Johnson stood at the plaintiff's table, her palms resting lightly on the edge of the polished oak, the faint scent of her morning coffee still lingering on her sleeves. The light from the tall windows caught the soft waves of her hair and reflected off the brass nameplate in front of her, the letters spelling out a name most here hadn't recognized yet. She looked up just once, meeting Richard's gaze directly, calm and steady, without a hint of intimidation. The lawyers on either side shuffled papers, their heels squeaking against the polished floor, a low murmur of "Did you hear that? And who does she think she is?" spreading among them. The judge's gavel tapped twice, a sharp punctuation that seemed almost lost beneath Richard's arrogant chuckle, yet it demanded attention. Amara's fingers flexed slightly, tracing invisible patterns on the smooth surface of the table, her heartbeat steady, though the air around her felt thick and expectant. Outside the courtroom, the city streets hummed with the familiar rhythm of honking cars and distant sirens, a stark contrast to the tense silence inside. Every eye in the room was drawn to her, some out of curiosity, some out of disbelief, but Amara held her posture like a pillar, grounded and unwavering. She had spent the last 5 years studying law in quiet libraries, watching procedural dramas, memorizing statutes, all while the world saw her as nothing more than a temporary assistant for filing documents and fetching coffee. Today, all that preparation converged in this moment. Richard's team exchanged uneasy glances, whispers of "she's just a temp," quickly fading as he leaned back, crossing his arms, his smirk unwavering. Yet beneath that smirk, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes, almost imperceptible. Amara cleared her throat softly, not to announce herself, but to ready the room for what was coming. "I am prepared to proceed on behalf of my client," she said, her voice smooth, measured, carrying just enough weight to stir the air without forcing it. A hush fell over the room, subtle but palpable, as the judge's gaze shifted, narrowing in curiosity, assessing the posture, the calm authority behind the words. Richard's lips twitched, caught between amusement and irritation, as the spectators leaned forward ever so slightly, drawn into the undercurrent of tension building like a silent wave ready to crest. The courtroom lights glinted off the polished floors, the soft ticking of the clock in the corner marking the slow passage of seconds that felt stretched, almost suspended. Amara's eyes swept over the gathered faces, noting the casual smirk of the opposing counsel, the suppressed chuckle of an observer at the back, the faint tightening of the stenographer's grip on her pen. She exhaled quietly, not out of nervousness but to release the invisible weight pressing on the air. In that exhale, there was clarity, a readiness to transform whispered doubts into undeniable presence. The moment stretched as Richard Hale's laugh faded, replaced by a silence heavy enough to feel, a silence that hung between every breath and every glance. And for just a heartbeat, the room seemed to acknowledge her, not as the assistant they assumed, not as the woman they underestimated, but as a force quietly, inevitably shifting the energy around her, preparing the ground for the truth to be spoken and heard. Amara took a slow step forward, her polished shoes making almost no sound against the cool marble floor, each movement deliberate, carrying a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the murmurs of surprise rippling through the room. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows traced patterns on the walls, catching the fine dust particles suspended in the air, and for a moment the courtroom felt suspended in a fragile balance. Each breath of those present waited with expectation. Richard Hale shifted slightly in his chair, the smirk lingering on his lips now tempered by a subtle tension he could not entirely mask, his eyes flicking repeatedly toward the documents in front of him, the lined pages crisp under his hands. Amara's fingers brushed over the edges of her own folder, tracing the indentation of her name engraved on the brass plaque, the cool metal grounding her amidst the silent scrutiny. The judge leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the desk, her eyes narrowing as she observed Amara's calm, unassuming demeanor, the faint creases of the courtroom's oak benches reflected in the light that streamed across the chamber. Every person in attendance seemed to hold their breath, the low rustle of papers, the soft click of a pen, and the subtle scrape of shoes against the polished floor forming a rhythm that drew the focus entirely to Amara's poised presence. Her gaze moved briefly across the faces of the spectators and opposing counsel, noting their uncertainty, their attempts to mask astonishment, the tiny shifts in posture and the minute, almost imperceptible intake of breath as they realized that this was no ordinary case. The air itself seemed denser here, charged with the gravity of knowledge and authority, yet she remained unshaken, her spine straight, shoulders relaxed, a quiet confidence emanating in waves that reached even the farthest corners of the chamber. Richard exhaled through his nose, a controlled sound that betrayed his inner calculation, as he attempted to maintain the illusion of dominance while recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that Amara possessed an understanding and skill that belied her position. The judge's gavel rested lightly before her, poised, the weight of her attention focused fully on the unfolding exchange, and as Amara began to organize her thoughts, her words prepared to unfurl a meticulous, factual presentation, the room leaned in collectively, drawn by the gravity of competence wrapped in unexpected humility. She adjusted her stance, the quiet click of her heels on the marble punctuating her internal rhythm, a silent cadence of readiness. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, yet carried a resonance that filled the room without straining, each word chosen with precision, commanding attention by virtue of clarity and purpose. Observers noted the subtle change in Richard's posture, the faint furrow of his brow, the twitch at the corner of his mouth as he realized the challenge before him was grounded in expertise rather than presumption. Every second stretched with deliberate tension, the courtroom itself a stage of suspended anticipation, waiting for the first revelation of insight that would shift the balance, a moment that would not rely on volume or theatrics, but on the undeniable weight of intellect, preparation, and integrity converging in Amara's poised presentation, her calm eyes reflecting the resolve of someone who had long prepared for this precise instant, and who now, in silence as much as in motion, held the room's undivided attention. Amara opened the folder on the desk, her fingers brushing against the edges of the neatly stacked documents, each sheet crisp under the courtroom lights, her eyes scanning the fine print with a quiet determination that seemed to draw the attention of everyone present. The soft hum of the ventilation system filled the room, mingling with the faint shuffle of papers and the subtle scratching of pens against legal pads, forming a rhythm that underscored the gravity of the moment. Richard Hale leaned forward slightly, his smile fading as he noticed the precision with which Amara pointed out inconsistencies and misstatements, her voice calm and deliberate, each word measured to leave no room for misinterpretation. The judge tilted her head, her gaze steady and observant, noticing the subtle confidence that radiated from Amara, a presence that suggested competence beyond the initial impression of her position. Amara's eyes flicked to the jurors, noting their growing attentiveness, the slight lean of heads, the careful tracking of her hand movements as she highlighted key passages and cross-referenced clauses with the poise of someone who had spent years mastering the law. The sunlight shifted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor, the patterns of light and dark emphasizing the contrast between perception and reality, between the assumptions of those seated and the truth being revealed by her meticulous examination. Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly, his earlier amusement replaced by a calculated assessment, as he realized that the challenge before him was founded on irrefutable knowledge rather than assumption or bravado. Amara continued, her voice never rising in anger or frustration, her tone steady, authoritative, yet measured with empathy for the audience, conveying clarity without arrogance, ensuring that every observer, from the court reporters to the quietest member of the gallery, could follow the logic and understand the implications of her findings. Each motion of her hand, each careful reference to the clauses, was deliberate, choreographed in a way that emphasized the weight of preparation and the integrity behind her words. The judge nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, signaling acknowledgement of the significance of Amara's observations, the subtle movement captured by the keen eyes of the room, further solidifying her presence as a central authority in the unfolding discussion. Richard's hands rested on the table, fingers tapping lightly, a silent measure of thought as he absorbed the depth of Amara's insight, the slight furrow of his brow betraying the shift in his perception of the case and of the woman who had quietly, methodically taken command of the room. The atmosphere grew taut, charged not with confrontation but with recognition, a collective understanding that the assumptions held by many were being upended by precise, unwavering competence. Amara's gaze met the judge's once more, the unspoken communication of mutual respect and acknowledgement passing in that fleeting, potent moment, and in the stillness that followed, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, attuned to the subtle power of truth, poise, and ethical mastery converging in the presence of a woman who had long been underestimated, yet now commanded attention by the simple, undeniable force of her knowledge. The courtroom settled into a tense stillness, each person acutely aware of the space between words, the weight of anticipation pressing down softly from the high ceilings. Amara shifted her gaze slightly, scanning the table in front of her with a quiet thoroughness, noting the subtle hesitation in Richard Hale's posture, the careful way his fingers hovered over the documents as though uncertain how to proceed. The polished wood reflected the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, casting long, linear patterns across the floor that seemed to guide every observer's eye toward her poised figure. She spoke again, softly but with unwavering clarity, articulating the precise legal precedents that underpinned her argument, the careful inflection of her voice emphasizing the key points with a rhythm that drew the room in without forcing attention. The judge's eyes followed her every motion, the slight nod of recognition acknowledging not only the accuracy of her statements, but the quiet authority that accompanied them, a presence that commanded respect without demanding it. Spectators shifted in their seats, subtle movements betraying the sense of realization that the individual they had underestimated was fully in command of the proceedings, her preparation and insight leaving an impression that resonated silently, yet powerfully across the room. Richard's smile, once easy and confident, now tightened imperceptibly, his brow furrowing as he readjusted his perspective, recognizing that Amara's knowledge was not just thorough but strategically deployed, a blend of intellect and calm that reframed the entire scenario. The soft murmur of papers turning and pens scratching the legal pads provided a measured accompaniment to her methodical explanation, each sound punctuating the depth of consideration and the deliberate pacing she maintained. Amara's fingers tapped lightly against the folder, a subtle rhythm that synchronized with the unspoken energy in the room, her composure steady as she prepared for the next segment of her presentation. The judge leaned slightly forward, an imperceptible gesture that conveyed anticipation and an acknowledgement of the complexity and nuance Amara brought to the discussion. Richard Hale's gaze shifted, caught between skepticism and reluctant admiration, as the layers of argument unfolded with an elegance that emphasized precision over theatrics. Each word, each careful reference to the legal framework, carried the weight of experience and understanding, commanding attention without raising volume, and drawing in every observer from the furthest corner of the chamber. The courtroom, previously filled with soft murmurs and suppressed laughter, now hummed with an attentive quiet, the audience collectively absorbing the shift in energy, the realization that competence and truth held an undeniable power that transcended initial assumptions and preconceptions. Amara's calm, steady eyes met the judge's for a fleeting moment, a silent exchange of recognition passing between them, and in that instant, the room seemed to pause, collectively acknowledging the quiet authority and unwavering integrity that she embodied, the subtle tension hanging in the air like a tangible presence that underscored the transformative power of knowledge and composure. Amara took a deep, measured breath, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom with calm assurance, noting the subtle shifts in body language as Richard Hale leaned slightly forward, the tension in his shoulders betraying the slightest uncertainty. The sunlight that streamed through the tall windows highlighted the polished surfaces of the benches and desks, casting faint reflections on the glossy floor, each glint of light emphasizing the contrast between expectation and reality in the room. She opened a new folder and placed it carefully on the desk, the faint click of the metal clasps punctuating the otherwise silent chamber. The judge adjusted her glasses, her gaze steady, taking in every detail of Amara's posture and composure, the precise cadence of her voice, and the deliberate pacing of her movements. Amara's fingers traced the edges of the legal documents, her eyes scanning line by line, her mind organizing arguments with surgical precision, ensuring that each point would land with clarity and authority. The jurors and spectators shifted subtly, leaning forward, their attention captured not by volume or theatrics, but by the quiet command she radiated, the undeniable presence of someone who knew exactly the weight of each word she would speak. Richard's hands tapped lightly against the table, a rhythmic counterpoint to the soft scrape of pens on legal pads and the occasional shuffle of papers, his confident demeanor now tempered by cautious calculation as he recognized the depth of preparation before him. Amara spoke again, her tone calm, even, yet infused with a quiet intensity, highlighting inconsistencies with methodical clarity, each point building upon the last, constructing a foundation that left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. The judge's subtle nods indicated recognition of the precision and integrity in her analysis, the small gestures magnified by the tension that filled the high-ceilinged courtroom. Sunlight glinted off the polished surfaces as Amara gestured lightly to the specific passages in her documents, guiding the attention of everyone present with graceful efficiency, her every motion purposeful, measured, and deliberate. The subtle inhalation and exhalation of those observing created a rhythm in the room, a collective awareness that the situation had shifted, that the underestimated presence of Amara had altered the energy, commanding respect through competence and poise rather than force. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly as he reviewed her points, the corners of his mouth twitching in a faint reflection of the surprise and recalibration occurring internally, his posture tense but controlled, signaling a recognition that the challenge he faced was grounded in truth and preparation rather than theatrics. The soft murmur of movement, the shift of papers, the quiet adjustment of chairs, underscored the focused atmosphere, each sound a reminder of the attentiveness and gravity enveloping the courtroom. Amara's calm gaze remained fixed on the judge, a silent communication of confidence and readiness passing between them, an unspoken understanding of mutual recognition. The room held its collective breath, the energy dense yet poised, waiting for the next revelation, a subtle anticipation that each word and motion of Amara would continue to unravel the assumptions that had filled the space moments before, transforming the perception of her from underestimated participant to central authority in the proceedings. A quiet demonstration of mastery and unassailable clarity that resonated through every observer in attendance. Amara straightened slightly, the soft fabric of her blouse catching the morning light streaming through the courtroom windows, her fingers brushing over the edge of the folder in front of her with a quiet deliberation. She took a measured breath, letting the stillness of the room settle around her, each observer acutely aware of the shift in energy as she prepared to address the next critical point. Richard Hale leaned back in his chair, his confident posture slightly restrained, the faint crease forming between his eyebrows betraying his growing awareness of the precision and authority she brought to the proceedings. The judge adjusted her spectacles and tilted her head, her gaze focused, attentive, and expectant, taking in every micro-expression, every slight movement, and each carefully measured word that Amara was about to offer. The polished oak of the desks reflected the sunlight, casting soft linear shadows that stretched across the room, emphasizing the contrasts between assumption and reality, between authority and competence. Amara began speaking, her voice calm, steady, and articulate, each word selected for clarity and impact, building a sequence of logical steps that demonstrated not only the weaknesses in the opposition's argument, but the thoroughness of her own preparation. The jurors shifted subtly, leaning forward in their seats, their eyes tracking the deliberate movements of her hands as she referenced documents and highlighted specific clauses, their expressions changing from casual attention to careful consideration. The low rustle of papers and the soft scratch of pens created a rhythm that underscored the intensity of the moment, punctuating each point with an unspoken acknowledgement of her competence. Richard Hale's fingers drummed lightly against the polished surface of the table, a silent measure of calculation as he reconsidered the weight of her assertions, his smirk replaced by a thoughtful pause that reflected his recognition of the thoroughness and skill behind each statement. Amara's eyes moved across the room with subtle awareness, noting the slight nods, the shifted glances, and the quiet expressions of surprise and respect that began to emerge among those who had initially underestimated her. The courtroom felt simultaneously expansive and intimate, the high ceilings and wide windows creating space for observation, while the collective attention focused tightly on the deliberate cadence of her argument, the calm authority in her voice, and the precision of her gestures. Each movement was intentional, her posture poised, her presence commanding yet measured, a quiet demonstration of knowledge and integrity that required no elevation of volume or theatrical display. The sunlight highlighted the contours of the room and the figures within it, emphasizing the depth and subtlety of the unfolding exchange, while the faint ticking of the courtroom clock served as a gentle, steady counterpoint to the tension that had gradually replaced earlier amusement. Amara continued, her explanations precise and deliberate, layering point upon point with an elegant simplicity, drawing attention to inconsistencies without drawing attention to herself. And in that subtle yet powerful unfolding, the energy in the room shifted perceptibly, the balance of authority beginning to tilt as her mastery of the material and calm, assured presence became undeniably clear to all who were watching. The judge's eyes flicked to her notes and back to Amara with a silent acknowledgement of competence, the faintest curve of her mouth signaling the recognition of skill and preparation, and the room collectively absorbed the transformation in perception, aware that the quiet authority of one underestimated individual was reshaping the attention, respect, and anticipation of everyone present. The soft murmur of the courtroom seemed to settle as Amara straightened her shoulders, her presence commanding attention without a word, the quiet authority in her stance drawing the focus of every eye in the room. Richard Hale shifted in his seat, his confident posture subtly recalibrating as he absorbed the careful, deliberate explanations that Amara had presented, the clarity and precision of her voice leaving little room for dismissal. The judge leaned slightly forward, her hands folded neatly on the polished desk, observing the interplay of strategy, knowledge, and composure that Amara demonstrated with an unassuming grace. Light streamed through the tall windows, reflecting off the glossy wooden floors and the brass fixtures, highlighting the meticulous organization of papers and the gentle, purposeful movements of Amara's hands as she referenced key documents with calm authority. The spectators, jurors, and court personnel watched closely, their earlier amusement replaced by attentive silence, a subtle shift that emphasized the impact of measured competence over bravado. Amara's eyes moved deliberately across the room, noting the quiet reactions, the tentative nods, the slight tilts of heads that betrayed growing respect, while Richard's gaze lingered on her, the corners of his mouth tightening as he acknowledged, without words, the undeniable command she had over the material and the room. Each sentence she spoke was methodically constructed, each point layered with logic and clarity, building upon the previous argument to establish a compelling, unassailable foundation. The low scratch of pens, the turning of pages, and the faint shuffle of chairs punctuated the rhythm of her presentation, reinforcing the attentive focus that seemed to ripple outward from her central presence. The judge's eyes flicked to the documents and back to Amara, her subtle nods confirming recognition of the skill, preparation, and composure that characterized her performance, a silent acknowledgement that the courtroom was witnessing not just a demonstration of knowledge but the embodiment of quiet authority. Richard's fingers drummed lightly on the table as he contemplated the thoroughness and accuracy of her observations, the tension in his posture now mixed with an unspoken respect, the dynamic in the room shifting imperceptibly as he recalibrated his assumptions. Amara continued to guide the attention of the court with measured gestures, her movements purposeful yet understated, each subtle indication drawing focus to the essential elements of the case while maintaining the equilibrium of the chamber. The light shifted across the room as the day progressed, casting nuanced patterns on the polished floors and walls, accentuating the contrast between perception and reality, between expectation and execution. The audience, now fully attuned to the unfolding proceedings, absorbed the meticulous balance of intellect, poise, and ethical clarity that Amara projected, recognizing in every gesture, and carefully enunciated phrase the presence of someone whose preparation, insight, and calm determination had quietly transformed the energy of the courtroom. The judge's subtle adjustments and the attentive posture of the jurors reflected a growing consensus, the quiet but undeniable acknowledgement that authority, knowledge, and integrity could command respect and influence without force. And in that moment, the room collectively felt the shift, the reordering of assumptions, and the emergence of Amara as the undeniable center of attention and control, a testament to the power of quiet mastery and measured action. Amara shifted slightly, letting her gaze sweep across the courtroom once more, the quiet confidence in her posture now fully resonating with the attentive audience, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk as if to anchor herself in the midst of the concentrated energy surrounding her. The sunlight reflected off the polished surfaces, casting subtle patterns on the floor and walls, each reflection emphasizing the deliberate movements of her hands and the precise placement of her documents. Richard Hale adjusted in his seat, a subtle tightening of his jaw indicating the shift in his internal calculation, the previously effortless smirk now tempered by a growing awareness of Amara's command of the material and the room. The judge leaned slightly forward, her fingers interlaced over the edge of the desk, eyes focused intently on Amara, absorbing every nuanced inflection and measured pause, acknowledging the deliberate authority behind each statement. The soft rustle of paper, the faint scratch of pens, and the muted shuffle of chairs created a quiet rhythm in the room, underscoring the intensity of the exchange without breaking the careful calm that Amara maintained. She began to outline the implications of her observations, each point carefully structured and clearly articulated, building a cohesive narrative that was impossible to ignore, highlighting the discrepancies with a calm authority that drew attention to the facts rather than her personal position. The jurors and spectators leaned in subtly, their attention captured by the measured cadence of her voice and the precision of her gestures, noting the quiet strength in the way she delivered her argument. Richard's gaze lingered on the pages in front of him, the faintest furrow appearing in his brow as he reassessed his previous assumptions, recognizing that the clarity and mastery displayed by Amara demanded a recalibration of his approach and perception. The room held a collective quiet, a tension not of confrontation but of attentive respect, each observer acutely aware of the shift in the dynamic, the energy subtly realigned around Amara's poised presence. Her voice continued, calm yet authoritative, carefully highlighting the logical flow and integrity of her findings, each word reinforcing the structured argument she had meticulously prepared. The sunlight glinted off her documents and the polished surfaces, accentuating the orderly precision and focus she brought to the room, while the judge's occasional nods and the subtle shifts of the audience confirmed the recognition of competence and preparation. Every gesture, every pause, and every inflection reinforced the quiet authority that Amara embodied, drawing the room further into her presence and establishing a clear and undeniable control over the proceedings, not through volume or dominance, but through clarity, composure, and unassailable mastery of the facts and procedures that defined the unfolding courtroom moment. Amara paused, letting the subtle silence settle across the courtroom like a soft but deliberate exhale, her eyes lifting to meet the judge's gaze with a measured steadiness that conveyed both confidence and clarity. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, tracing linear patterns across the polished floor and highlighting the careful arrangement of her documents, each page a testament to preparation and precision. Richard Hale shifted slightly in his chair, the faint tension in his posture betraying the growing realization that the room's focus had firmly aligned with Amara's composed authority. The judge leaned forward, resting her hands lightly on the desk, her attention fully absorbed in the meticulous articulation of the facts, the logical sequence unfolding with a calm, yet undeniable force. Amara's voice carried smoothly, articulating the implications of the discrepancies she had uncovered, each word deliberate, each point grounded in evidence, drawing the attention of the spectators, the jurors, and even the opposing counsel. The low rustle of paper and the soft scratching of pens provided a subtle rhythm that accentuated the careful pacing of her argument, emphasizing the weight of precision and knowledge over theatrics or volume. Richard's gaze shifted between her documents and her composed presence, a flicker of reassessment passing across his expression as he acknowledged, without words, the depth of her insight and the accuracy of her observations. The courtroom absorbed the shift, the subtle energy moving like a wave as the initial perception of underestimation gave way to recognition of competence, skill, and poise. Amara's hands moved gently over her papers, indicating passages and clauses with controlled gestures, guiding the room through the logical flow with an effortless authority that was both understated and commanding. The judge's slight nods, the attentive posture of the jurors, and the quiet focus of the audience reflected the growing acknowledgement that the argument being laid out was precise, methodical, and undeniably strong. Each sentence built upon the last, reinforcing the clarity of her case and the credibility of her presence, while the light continued to trace the contours of the room, casting soft reflections that accentuated the careful order and professionalism surrounding her. The subtle creak of chairs and the occasional adjustment of pens punctuated the dense attention, underscoring the collective awareness of the room as it shifted fully to recognize Amara's poised command. Her calm gaze remained fixed on the judge, a silent but powerful communication of confidence, integrity, and readiness, each point delivered with careful deliberation and precision. The room's atmosphere, once tinged with casual expectation, now hummed with a focused attentiveness, the weight of Amara's preparation and measured delivery transforming the energy, reshaping assumptions, and solidifying her presence as the central figure guiding the proceedings with quiet authority and unassailable clarity. Amara paused for a brief moment, letting the weight of her words sink into the silence that had fallen over the courtroom, the soft glow of the morning sun accentuating the calm, deliberate expressions. On her face, Richard Hale leaned slightly forward, his confident posture now tempered with a subtle unease, the slight tightening of his jaw revealing the internal recalculation taking place as he recognized the depth and precision of her analysis. The judge adjusted her seating, leaning just a fraction closer to the desk, her eyes focused intently on Amara as she outlined the implications of each precedent and legal nuance, her voice steady and articulate, carrying the authority of meticulous preparation. The polished wooden floor reflected the long lines of sunlight streaming through the tall windows, casting patterns that moved slowly across the room, mirroring the steady, methodical rhythm of her explanation. The jurors shifted attentively, leaning in to catch each detail, their faces showing growing recognition of the thoroughness and clarity in her presentation, the subtle nods and focused expressions signaling that the impact of her argument was becoming increasingly undeniable. Amara's hands moved with precise, measured gestures, indicating relevant passages and supporting documentation, guiding the room's attention naturally without a hint of force, her movements reinforcing the logic and structure of her argument with quiet authority. The soft murmur of papers turning, pens scratching lightly on notepads, and the faint scrape of chair legs provided a subtle, almost musical rhythm to the proceedings, underscoring the attentive energy in the room while never overpowering the calm command she maintained. Richard's gaze tracked every movement, the corners of his mouth twitching slightly as he absorbed the rigor and accuracy of her points, an unspoken acknowledgement forming in his expression that this was no ordinary presentation but a demonstration of precise mastery. The judge's subtle shifts, her deliberate attention to the articulation of each point, conveyed recognition of competence and preparation, reinforcing the gravity of the unfolding exchange. Amara continued, layering one logical observation upon another, each explanation building on the last with seamless continuity, her measured cadence drawing the room into the sequence of reasoning she had so carefully constructed. The sunlight catching the edges of the documents, the polished surfaces, and the subtle reflections across the room highlighted the clarity and order she brought to the case, emphasizing the quiet authority of preparation and knowledge over noise or performance. Every observer, from the jurors to the spectators, felt the shift in perception, the unspoken acknowledgement that the underestimated figure before them possessed control and insight that demanded respect. Her calm, steady gaze met the judge's briefly, a silent exchange that reinforced mutual recognition of the intellectual and ethical rigor she displayed, while the tension in Richard Hale's posture reflected the subtle but undeniable realization that the balance of attention, authority, and credibility had definitively shifted toward Amara. The atmosphere of the courtroom, once filled with expectation and casual assumption, now hummed with focused respect and attentive observation, each subtle sound and measured gesture underscoring the power of clarity, preparation, and unshakable composure as Amara continued to command the room with quiet mastery. Amara felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a quiet ripple moving through the courtroom as the implications of her careful presentation began to settle over every observer. Richard Hale's confident composure had noticeably softened, the tightness in his jaw and the slight narrowing of his eyes signaling the internal reassessment of both the case and the woman before him. The judge leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the desk, observing the meticulous progression of Amara's argument, noting the careful way she had aligned facts, precedent, and ethical clarity in a seamless demonstration of both knowledge and poise. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows continued to illuminate the polished wood and brass fixtures, each reflective surface catching the light in a way that underscored the crisp order and deliberate motion of Amara's gestures as she referenced critical sections of the documents in front of her. The jurors, previously tense with anticipation, now leaned forward in their seats, the subtle tilt of heads and the attentive focus of their eyes revealing the gradual acknowledgement that the unfolding presentation carried a force of reasoning and integrity that could not be ignored. Amara's voice remained steady, clear, and confident, each carefully enunciated word layered upon the last, building a coherent and persuasive argument that drew in the room, commanding attention through calm authority rather than volume or display. The soft scratch of pens, the rustle of pages, and the slight movement of chairs created a background rhythm that accentuated rather than distracted, a gentle reinforcement of the attentiveness of everyone present. Richard's fingers traced the edges of the table lightly, a subtle sign of concentration and recalibration as he processed the meticulous and unassailable points Amara laid before the court, recognizing for the first time the depth of expertise and careful planning behind each argument. Amara's eyes scanned the courtroom briefly, noting the subtle expressions of curiosity, surprise, and growing respect across the audience, the gentle nods of the jurors, the attentive posture of court staff, and even the silent acknowledgement in the judge's slight lean forward. Each movement she made was deliberate, reinforcing her presence without drawing unnecessary attention, a choreography of composure, clarity, and authority that guided the room through the logical and factual foundation of her position. The atmosphere held a concentrated intensity, the soft patterns of sunlight shifting with the passage of time, emphasizing the careful and deliberate pacing of her delivery. Every subtle inflection, measured pause, and precise reference underscored her mastery of both content and context, quietly transforming the perceptions of those who had previously underestimated her, while the calm assurance in her posture and voice created an unspoken yet undeniable assertion of credibility and competence. The courtroom, once filled with the faint murmur of expectation, now radiated focused attentiveness, the balance of authority perceptibly realigned as Amara's steady presence, meticulous reasoning, and unwavering poise commanded recognition and respect from all who were present, setting the stage for the next pivotal moment in the proceedings. The judge's eyes shifted slightly, a subtle signal that the courtroom's attention was about to pivot, and Amara felt the familiar, calm focus settle over her as she prepared to present the culmination of her argument. Sunlight continued to pour through the tall windows, glinting off the polished wood and brass fixtures, casting gentle reflections across the floor that mirrored the deliberate rhythm of her gestures and the poised flow of her voice. Richard Hale's expression, once filled with a confident smirk, had softened into a careful watchfulness, the faint tension along his jaw and the measured tilt of his head revealing an internal reckoning with the depth and accuracy of her presentation. Amara opened a fresh section of her documents, the crisp sound of the folder and papers punctuating the silence as she outlined the broader consequences of the points she had meticulously built, each statement precise, methodical, and grounded in evidence, allowing no room for misinterpretation. The jurors leaned forward slightly, their eyes attentive, absorbing every nuance of her explanation, while the soft rustle of pages and the subtle scratch of pens punctuated the room's tense but focused rhythm. The judge's subtle nods confirmed the recognition of Amara's preparation and ethical clarity, the small gestures magnified by the heightened attentiveness of the courtroom, signaling acknowledgement of her unassailable presence. Richard's fingers traced lightly along the edge of his table, a quiet indicator of calculation and reflection as he processed the layers of reasoning and composure Amara had demonstrated. The earlier air of casual dismissal replaced by careful consideration and reluctant respect. Amara's voice remained calm and steady, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of logic and integrity, while her hands moved with precise, measured gestures to guide attention to critical sections of the documents, ensuring clarity without drawing unnecessary focus on herself. The sunlight shifted across the room with the passing of minutes, casting long patterns across the floor and desks, highlighting the careful balance of authority, attention, and evidence in the space. The soft, almost imperceptible movements of the courtroom, the adjustment of pens, the shifting of chairs, the intake of breath by observers, amplified the impact of her deliberate presentation, each subtle action reinforcing the attentive energy that had fully aligned with her steady command. The jurors and spectators were collectively drawn into the flow of her argument, their focus fully on the precise articulation of facts and the clarity of her reasoning, while the judge's eyes followed each reference and inflection with careful scrutiny. Amara's calm and assured presence, the meticulous construction of her points, and the quiet authority with which she delivered them had transformed the room, commanding attention and respect through competence, integrity, and poise, shifting the dynamic so that every observer recognized her as the central and guiding force of the proceedings. The balance in the courtroom had perceptibly shifted, the initial assumptions of authority and control now realigned to acknowledge the undeniable skill, preparation, and measured confidence of Amara, as each person absorbed the finality and significance of the argument she had laid before them, establishing an unspoken consensus of recognition and respect for the quiet mastery and ethical command she displayed. The courtroom held a rare, profound silence, each observer acutely aware that the tension of the day had shifted into a quiet resolution, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows illuminating the polished wood and brass in soft, warm tones. Amara stood with her hands resting lightly on the desk, her posture perfectly composed, her gaze steady, reflecting both confidence and a calm sense of closure that resonated across the room. Richard Hale remained seated, his fingers interlaced on the table, eyes tracing the contours of the documents she had meticulously referenced, a faint tightening of his jaw revealing a mixture of surprise and reluctant acknowledgement at the clarity, precision, and integrity with which she had presented her case. The judge leaned back slightly in her chair, eyes still attentive but softening, a subtle nod indicating recognition of the thoroughness, composure, and ethical certainty that Amara had brought to every point, a quiet endorsement of her authority and mastery. The jurors shifted gently, their expressions a blend of admiration and respect, acknowledging in the understated way of careful observers that the balance of insight, preparation, and presence had decisively shifted, highlighting the power of knowledge delivered with poise. Amara's fingers traced lightly along the edge of her folder, each movement deliberate, echoing the measured rhythm of her voice as she concluded the logical and factual sequence of her presentation, drawing the room's collective attention to the precision of her reasoning and the integrity with which she had engaged every aspect of the case. Richard exhaled softly, a gesture that seemed to release the tension he had carried throughout the proceedings, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them of the respect earned not through position or arrogance, but through careful preparation, calm authority, and undeniable competence. The soft murmur of papers and the subtle movement of pens punctuated the stillness as Amara allowed the room to absorb the culmination of her argument, her voice having carried clarity, strength, and reason without ever raising volume or demanding attention, instead inviting recognition through the power of measured delivery and ethical composure. The sunlight continued to shift gently, casting nuanced reflections across the room that highlighted the meticulous order and the subtle power dynamics now realigned, with every eye trained on the quiet mastery and poised confidence that she embodied. Amara's calm presence, the deliberate flow of her words, and the careful orchestration of gestures created a final, unspoken impression, a statement of authority and competence that needed no further amplification, leaving the audience in silent acknowledgement of her capability. The courtroom seemed to exhale as one, the tension dissolving into a collective respect, each observer absorbing the quiet but profound lesson of integrity, preparation, and the subtle, undeniable authority of truth. In that stillness, Amara's gaze swept once more across the room, a final, composed acknowledgement of the shift she had facilitated, the subtle affirmation that intellect, poise, and ethical mastery could command attention, reshape perception, and leave an enduring impression that spoke louder than words, volume, or spectacle. The soft light in the courtroom shifted as the sun climbed higher, casting gentle reflections on the polished wood and the brass details of the desks, highlighting the measured movements of Amara as she closed her folder and allowed a moment of quiet to settle over the room. Richard Hale remained seated, his posture straight but no longer confident, the earlier smirk replaced by a contemplative expression as he absorbed the full impact of her carefully delivered arguments and the undeniable clarity she had brought to every point. The judge, leaning slightly forward with her hands resting on the desk, regarded Amara with a calm, evaluative gaze, acknowledging not only the logical coherence of her presentation, but the composure, ethical clarity, and quiet authority that accompanied it. Every juror, clerk, and spectator in the room seemed to sense the shift in energy, the room now fully attuned to the presence of someone who had transformed expectation into respect through precision, poise, and measured confidence. Amara's hands remained lightly resting on the desk as she allowed the audience to fully absorb the sequence of reasoning, the implications of her observations, and the subtle yet powerful demonstration of mastery and preparation that had unfolded throughout the proceedings. The gentle rustle of papers, the soft scratching of pens, and the slight shifting of chairs created a background rhythm that underscored the room's attentive focus, emphasizing the quiet intensity that had replaced the initial tension and casual assumptions. Richard's gaze drifted briefly to the documents in front of him, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table, reflecting a silent acknowledgement of the meticulousness, clarity, and insight Amara had displayed, a recognition that authority and competence could manifest without overt display or volume. The sunlight caught the edges of her papers, the reflective surfaces of the polished wood, and the subtle highlights in the brass fixtures, casting the room in a warm glow that mirrored the calm resolution of the moment. Amara's eyes lifted slowly, scanning the courtroom one final time, taking in the attentive expressions, the subtle nods, and the quiet acknowledgement of respect that had been earned through measured words, precise logic, and unwavering composure. The atmosphere of the courtroom was now one of focused appreciation, the energy transformed into a collective recognition of the power of preparation, intellect, and ethical mastery. Every subtle gesture, every inflection, and every carefully constructed argument had contributed to a shift in perception, creating a room where attention, respect, and understanding aligned with the presence and authority she embodied. The judge's final glance, Richard's contemplative posture, and the attentive engagement of the jurors reflected a shared awareness that the balance of perception and respect had been irrevocably transformed, a testament to the quiet but profound impact of calm authority, precise reasoning, and the understated yet undeniable force of competence. In that suspended, almost tangible stillness, Amara allowed herself a measured breath, the room collectively acknowledging her poise, clarity, and ethical command, leaving an enduring impression of quiet mastery and integrity that resonated far beyond the final words spoken. The courtroom exhaled in a subtle, collective rhythm as Amara stepped back from the desk, her posture still poised and composed, a quiet command lingering in the air as the final words of her argument settled into the consciousness of everyone present. Richard Hale remained seated, his confident demeanor now replaced by a reflective stillness, the corners of his mouth tightening slightly as he absorbed the totality of her meticulous reasoning, the clarity, and the ethical precision she had maintained throughout the proceedings. The judge, leaning back just enough to indicate a shift from attentive evaluation to measured acknowledgement, let her eyes pass over Amara one last time, recognizing not only the logical mastery she had displayed, but the quiet authority and composure that had guided every point with unwavering assurance. The sunlight through the tall windows continued to cast long, soft reflections across the polished floors and desks, emphasizing the stillness and attentiveness that now permeated the room. The jurors and spectators, fully engaged throughout, sat with subtle nods and reflective expressions, understanding without words that the balance of perception had irrevocably shifted, that the woman they had initially underestimated had demonstrated mastery and integrity that demanded recognition. Amara allowed her eyes to move across the courtroom, noting the careful observation of each individual, the subtle gestures of respect, and the quiet acceptance of authority not demanded by volume, but earned through precision, poise, and ethical clarity. Her hands rested lightly on the desk, the faint shift of her fingers mirroring the deliberate rhythm of her delivery, the calm certainty of her presence underscoring the finality and significance of the argument she had orchestrated. Richard's gaze briefly met hers, a silent acknowledgement passing between them of the respect earned through intellect, preparation, and measured composure, the room responding as a collective audience to the integrity and quiet power she embodied. Every slight movement, the adjusting of papers, the soft scratch of pens, the subtle shift of weight in chairs, accentuated the attentive energy that had transformed the atmosphere from one of casual assumption to careful recognition. The sunlight, moving imperceptibly across the floor, mirrored the steady, deliberate pacing of her presence, highlighting the clarity, preparation, and ethical command she projected without any need for assertion or theatrical emphasis. Amara's calm and focused demeanor, the deliberate articulation of her points, and the understated authority with which she conducted herself left an enduring impression that resonated silently but powerfully across the courtroom. Each observer absorbed the transformation of perception, the subtle acknowledgement of mastery and moral integrity, the room collectively recognizing the quiet yet undeniable impact of competence guided by poise and preparation. As the moment stretched into stillness, the energy shifted fully in favor of reason, clarity, and ethical authority, leaving the courtroom bathed in a sense of quiet resolution, respect, and lasting recognition for the force of knowledge, composure, and integrity that Amara had so meticulously embodied throughout the proceedings.